This is Paul Johnson with New Frontiers. Now, my guest today, we actually recorded some time back under the Optimistic American. Professor James Robinson has written a number of different books, but what's exciting was that for the book that we were talking to him about, he's been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, it's been well deserved because the book, Why Nations Fail, is a book that literally changed my line of thinking on both politics and what it is that makes American society great. He's written a number of other books, including an acclaimed book called The Economic Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy in 2005. And then along with Acemoglu, who was his partner in Why Nations Fail, he wrote a book called The Narrow Corridor, States and Society and the Fate of Liberty. Professor Robinson is literally one of the best intellectual minds in America. And if you listen to what he has to say, he will have a profound impact on your thinking. Now, I'm going to do just a little bit of an editorial before we start this, because as I said, we'd recorded this just a little while back. I want to start with the premise of his book. And the premise of his book is that institutions have a huge effect on society. And more importantly, institutions that are inclusive as opposed to extractive make a major difference in the prosperity of a nation. So who's instructive on this point that Professor Robinson likes is an economist, Max Weber. Now, Max Weber had this theory that I like, which is the theory of the economic engine. What he said is that government's really not the economic engine, that the economic engine is really produced by people who are in the private sector, the goods and the products that they produce. Now, government can have a huge effect on them. And generally, at least in our society, they have an effect by tapping into the economic engine and drawing off resources to pay for things that you and I may see as being important. Education, police departments, fire departments, whatever. But if they overtax that engine, they stall the engine's ability to survive. So think about the ways that it taps into it, mainly through taxation and regulation. And in those two ways, if you overtax it or overregulate it, you can have a negative impact on it. But you can also have an impact, according to Professor Robinson, by the rights that you give to different citizens. Our government has done many great things. We've built bridges and dams. We even put somebody on the moon. But the single greatest thing that our government did from the very beginning was that it empowered the individual over itself. The power of government that is successful and that determines why nations fail, as Professor Robinson will talk to you about in a moment, is the idea that when you empower the individual, when you include them in the process, when you create more buyers and more sellers, and you empower people to be a part of that system, your system becomes much more successful. And when you take those things away, they fail. We're excited to have Professor Robinson here on the show. If you like what it is that we're doing and what it is that we're talking about, go ahead and press that subscribe button. You know, I'm just an ordinary, optimistic American who still believes that the United States is a cause for good. If you believe that too, join us in this program. I know you'll love hearing the Nobel Prize winner, Professor Robinson, and what he has to say about what makes a country successful and what makes it fail.
Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Welcome, Professor James Robinson. How are you doing today?
Very good, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming on our show. And here's the first question that I'd like to ask you. I really do think that both of your books, the Why Nations Fail and The Narrow Corridor, are probably two of the most important books that anyone needs to read from an economic standpoint as well as a political standpoint. Now, I spent a long time in politics. I was mayor of Phoenix, 20 years ago or something like that. And I've been listening to the doomsayers for a long time. I've never seen it as intense as it is today. We just, on our comment posts on YouTube, you'll just see these people who have these incredible versions of how bad it is in the United States and how the country is going to fail. I know that you studied in your book, Why Nations Fail, you were also studying Why Nations Prosper. But, I remember the chapter on Venice and listening to some of the other portions of the book as well. In your study of Why Nations Fail, where do you think the United States is today?
Well, I think the United States, the institutions in the United States are being challenged. But I think one of the things that we point out in the book is that that's not the first time. The institutions in the United States have been challenged lots of times. We talk about the robber barons in the 19th century, or we talk about Roosevelt's plan to pack the Supreme Court in the 1930s. So I think there's nothing new about that. I think, we make this distinction between societies with extractive and inclusive institutions. And in a society with inclusive institutions, there's always incentives to set that into reverse. You mentioned Venice. That's kind of one of the most interesting examples. That Venice might have been the most prosperous place in the world in the late Middle Ages, and everything went into reverse, and all the institutions that had generated that prosperity were dismantled, basically. So it can happen, it can happen. But I think that's rather unlikely in the United States. I think I think many things have been surprising in this country in the last 5 or 6 years. But I think one thing you've seen is that a lot of people are willing to stand up and fight for the institutions. They believe in the institutions, even at the expense of their own careers and jobs. They're willing to kind of put their money where their mouth is, and that's what makes this country work so well. That's not true in Argentina. That's not true in Colombia. It's not true in many parts of the world. So I'm still optimistic that, there's challenges, but also sometimes challenges are good. There's a lot of discontent in this country. I think like my main reading of the whole January 6th event, after President Trump lost the election was, gosh, we should understand better why all these people are so unhappy and why there's so much discontent in this country. So it's a wake-up call. One reading of it is it's a wake-up call to understand these people better and understand why they're so unhappy. So I think that's my basic take on it.
Okay, so extractive and inclusive institutions as well as political systems. That it's a very simple concept, but it definitely needs some explaining. So if you would you just give you don't even need to make it brief. Help us have an understanding of what exactly that meant and why it's important.
Yeah, so Why Nations Fail is trying to explain the enormous differences in prosperity you see in the world. I just came back on Saturday from 3 weeks doing research in Nigeria, and levels of prosperity in Nigeria are, perhaps, I don't know, 5% of what they are in the United States, or 2%, or, it depends how you adjust for living standards. But the fraction, the living standards of people in Nigeria is just awful. The roads are terrible. There's no electricity. There's no running water in large parts of the country. Basic kind of services and amenities that we all take for granted don't exist. So how is it that in the modern world today, you have societies that just differ so much in terms of living standards, prosperity, with all the consequences that has for people's health and longevity and standards of living? So that's what the book is about, trying to understand, both why that is today, but also historically, because the United States didn't become the United States 10 years ago, and Nigeria didn't become Nigeria 10 years ago either. That's a long historical process. So that's also part of the book. And what we argue is basically that's to do with the incentives in society, the rules that govern people's incentives and opportunities. That the difference between the United States and a place like Nigeria is in the United States, you have what we call inclusive institutions, which are rules in the economy, first of all, that create broad-based incentives and opportunities. And Nigeria doesn't have that. Nigeria has the opposite, what we call extractive institutions. Extractive institutions, they may concentrate opportunities in the hands of some people. The richest man in Africa happens to be Nigerian, but most people don't get access to opportunities and don't have incentives at all. So inclusive and extractive, and why, let me dwell then, since you encouraged me, on why inclusive. Why do we use, I think that word inclusive is very important. We've known, for many decades, since the work of Robert Solow in the 1950s in economics, that what really drives prosperity, what drives economic growth, is innovation, new technologies, new ideas, entrepreneurship, creativity, all the things that make human society so exciting. And where does that come from? That comes from people's ideas, people's projects, people's aspirations, people's drive. That's where innovation comes from. If you look at the industrial, the whole start of all this prosperity in the modern world, which starts in the 18th century in England, it's about innovation. It's the steam engine, it's steam trains, it's the factory system, it's the mechanization of cotton spinning, it's all new ideas, new innovation, raising productivity. Who came up with those ideas? Who invented the steam engine or the railway or tarmac or, whatever it was? What you see is that those people come from everywhere in society. You don't know who they are. The government doesn't know who they are. I don't know who they are. So what you need to be successful economically is a system of rules, a system of, what we call institutions, what social scientists called institutions, that create very broad-based incentives and opportunities. So all that talent can get to the top. So you can get a loan, so you can start a business, so you can have secure property rights, so you can invest and enjoy the fruits of your efforts and your investment. So that's what, and all that talent gets to the top. I always think, I worked a lot in Africa, for the last 25 years. And, one sentence version of like why Africa is like it is like wasted talent. No, it's like a two word version. It's like there's so much talent, and it's trapped. It can't flourish the way it can flourish in the United States. So that's this idea of inclusion. We need to include everybody, to give all these opportunities and for everybody, and incentives for everybody. And that's what you don't have in a place like Nigeria. Some people have great incentives if you have the right connections or whatever, but most people, they don't. So inclusive and extractive. So that's, I'm kind of talking about the economic sphere, talking about the Industrial Revolution. If you look at the 19th century, in the US, when the US becomes the world economic leader, what's driving that? Innovation, entrepreneurship. Who's doing it? Individuals are, people from all over the social spectrum. There's beautiful research on this by economic historians, like looking at, where do innovators come from? Where do they come from? Who are they? Like, who were their parents? Just sort of looking at the sociology of innovation. And what you see is people come from everywhere, all over the social spectrum. And so if you want, you've got to tap into that. And that's what inclusion is about. But in some sense, we're talking about economic institutions. So there's two layers of this. There's inclusive economic institutions. There's extractive economic institutions. At the end of the first chapter, we kind of illustrate this with not two countries, but two people, which is Bill Gates and Carlos Slim, who were the two richest men in the world at the time we wrote the book, and both incredibly talented, driven entrepreneurs. But it's not how rich they are, but how they made their money that's so interesting. Bill Gates, for all the criticisms you could make about Microsoft, made his money by innovating in the computer industry. He sucked enormous amounts of talent and energy into that industry. Carlos Slim made his money by getting his friends in the government to privatize a telecom monopoly to him. Bill Gates, actually, for all his wealth, generated far more wealth than he himself benefited from. There's huge externalities in that process. The opposite is true with Carlos Slim. A very conservative calculation made by the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development calculated that national income in Mexico was over, the fall in national income associated with Carlos Slim's monopoly was over double his personal fortune. So it's not just about taking money from the average Mexican and giving it to Carlos Slim. Everybody's poorer at the same time. So that's what extractive institutions do. That's a kind of microcosm of why there's incentives to create extractive institutions, but why they impoverish society. But then, the next layer of this is to say, okay, fine. So some countries have inclusive economic institutions and they innovate and there's entrepreneurship and they prosper, and other societies have extractive economic institutions. Like where does that come from? Fundamentally, like why does a society like that get set up? And that's to do with politics. When I give a talk about why nations fail, I put up the slide of Bill Gates, being dragged in front of the antitrust authorities in Washington. Microsoft was found guilty of violating the Sherman Act, for monopolistic practices. That scene is just unimaginable in Mexico or Nigeria or whatever. There's just no way that that's ever going to happen, because these people are too politically connected for anything like that to occur. So again, we could argue about the ruling, the Microsoft ruling, and whether it was good or whether they should have gone further or whatever. But I think what you see in the United States is what fundamentally protects that inclusive economy is an inclusive political system. So we say, there's two layers. There's the economic layer, there's inclusive and extractive economic institutions, but lying behind that is politics in some sense. It's politics that generates an extractive economy, and it's politics that generates an inclusive economy. Why did Venice, you mentioned Venice, why did Venice go into reverse? Why did the inclusive economic institutions become dismantled and turned extractive? Because the politics made a transition from inclusive to extractive. Okay, and what do we mean by inclusive political institutions? Well, broad-based political rights, accountability, democracy, but also a state which is powerful enough to implement the law and the rules. So there's two dimensions to this. You need accountability, but you need the state capacity. It's not just a matter of the laws. In Mexico, they have great antitrust laws. I know who wrote them, but the state can't enforce them against Carlos Slim. Impossible. So you need these two elements. And I think if you look at most poor countries, like Nigeria, for example, you see massive failure in one or both of those dimensions, either in the extent of accountability or kind of political participation, or what we call a broad distribution of political power, or in the capacity of the state. If you drive from Port Harcourt, I just drove from Port Harcourt to Owerri, which is about 100 kilometers in eastern Nigeria. I was stopped 25 times by police and military who want bribes and kind of shaking down. It's just like such a palaver, my mother would have said. It's like you have to negotiate. It's 100 kilometers, but it could take you all day because you have to negotiate with all these robbers, basically, and they're all working for the government. So that there's just huge challenges with the way the state works. If you go into a village in Nigeria, and nobody expects the government to do anything. You have to provide everything yourself: water, schools, everything, security, order. The government doesn't do a thing. So that's a fundamental problem for just even if you wanted to create inclusive institutions, or even if voters and citizens wanted to create them in Nigeria, the state doesn't have the organizational capacity to actually do it. Am I talking too long?
No, not at all. So in the United States, it seems to me that we started with this beautiful idea that said that we wanted to release the genius of the individual, and we did that through the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, property rights that were all included within it. I know that you've given both talks, and I've read some on what you've spoken about on the patent industry, and maybe if you could talk a little bit about that, because I think that really points out how almost from the beginnings of our country, we put a focus on innovation.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful example of an inclusive institution. The patent, this whole issue of patents was you go back to the 17th century in England, the 1620s, there was contests over patents and kind of property rights for innovators. And at the time of the Constitution, as you say, that it was written in the Constitution, and the first patent board met in 1790. And it was so important that Thomas Jefferson was on it, like someone as important as Jefferson was on the patent board deciding, whose innovations should warranted a patent. So I think that shows like how important people understood this. And what's interesting about the patent, and actually those examples, the examples I gave you of who the social background of innovators in the 19th century US or 20th century, where does that information come from? It actually comes from patent data. So patents, if somebody files a patent, then you can trace who these people are, and historians have investigated these people's background. So I think what's interesting about the patent is, anyone could take out a patent, and everyone paid the same price for the patent, and the state protected your intellectual property rights. That creates, innovations. I was mentioning, with Bill Gates, that innovations, this is something that, Paul Romer emphasized a lot, who got the Nobel Prize for his work on kind of innovation and technical change, that ideas are just what economists call non-rivalrous things. I can have an idea, and then you can have it, and you can use it, and that it doesn't cost me anything. It doesn't extinguish anything, or it's not like a cup of coffee. If I drink the cup of coffee, you can't drink the cup of coffee. But ideas aren't like that. But that's a problem for creating innovation, because it means that if I invent something, you can copy it without making effort. So patent plays a very important role in protecting my intellectual property rights and creating much better incentives, kind of aligning my personal incentives with the social incentives, for the incentives for society, in such a way as to encourage innovation. So I think the patent system was absolutely crucial in terms of stimulating innovation, and it still happens today. Like most of these people, Steve Jobs, everybody, Bill Gates, they have lots of patents. It's more complicated now because companies have patents, and it's more sort of institutionalized than it was in the 19th century. It's kind of cleaner. We can look at Edison, and Edison had over 1,000 patents. I think he was probably the world record patent holder, but everybody's still taking out patents. And I think, it's very well established in economics, the connection between patenting and innovation. And it's a brilliant example of an inclusive economic institution.
Yeah, I think that Romer's book, wasn't it The Wealth and Knowledge of Nations? I think that was the name of his book, taken from a big part from Adam Smith, which, by the way, I read a lot of Adam Smith and a lot of what you all have written. But one of the things that I find interesting, I love Ayn Rand, especially Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, and a series of books that she's written. But she was very antitrust. She thought that somehow or another that was taking something from the individual. Our antitrust laws, there's a great book called, I think, Titan, about Rockefeller, where it talks about the antitrust laws coming into place. Your work actually says that it seems to say that it was valuable, because not only can government become extractive, but when corporations can begin to dominate or monopolize an industry like Carlos Slim has, they also can be extractive.
I think that's right. I think that's what the facts are. I think, if you study developing countries, like Colombia, I work a lot in Colombia. I teach in Bogota every summer. In Colombia, all the strings are being pulled, by these, they're not as famous as Carlos Slim or other people, but they manage the political system, the economy. There's enormous barriers to entry, like they create enormous barriers to entry, barriers to innovation. I think markets are a great thing, but sometimes markets don't work, because people don't want them to work, and because they can block competition and they can block innovation, because that's good for them. And I think, if people have the power, they can disrupt markets. So I think you do need antitrust to try. I think the data suggests, the evidence, historical evidence suggests, that you do need antitrust to stop individuals dominating markets, to too large an extent, because that does block innovation and it does impede inclusion.
Yeah, I remember one of the stories that I enjoyed listening to was the idea that we used to have 3 steel companies: U.S. Steel, Bethlehem Steel, I forget what the third one was, but somebody started making rebar and small smelters, and the big steel companies felt like wasn't such a big deal because it was a low margin product, and they gave it up. But over time, as those small smelters kept eating into them, eventually it bankrupted the 3 big companies, and they had to reorganize. But it was a creative destruction that was taking place and remaking the steel industry, making it more affordable, making our products cheaper. The analysis was done with China, where they had a large steel smelter company, and someone went to go into business to make rebar, and they put them in prison for the rest of their life. That becomes a very extractive policy. I'd love to know, China has certainly an extractive political sphere, but they seem to have a more inclusive economic one. I'd love to know your take on China, not only what you've seen that's been happening, but where you think they are.
Yeah, I think China partly fits what I'm talking about fantastically. If you think about go back to the 1970s, China was very poor, technologically backward. It had extremely extractive kind of socialist economic institutions. And what drove Chinese economic growth was exactly dismantling all of that. Like, where did Deng Xiaoping start? In agriculture. He basically abolished collectivized agriculture. He introduced this thing called the household responsibility system. What did that do? It allowed people to make decisions, basically what to plant, what to farm. He deregulated prices. He gave people incentives, and what happened is just productivity went through the roof, and then that moved into the industrial sector into the 1980s. And, so what's funny about China is that, people sort of talk about the genius of the Communist Party, but actually the real story is the Communist Party just stopped trying to micromanage and got off everyone's backs and allowed them to do, what they do, allowed Jack Ma to do what he's good at. And that's why the economy boomed, so not through the genius of the Communist Party. And I guess what we say is, so that fits perfectly. Like, all the economic growth is driven by this movement towards much more inclusive economic institutions. But the political institutions have stayed extractive, they're not, there's no accountability, there's no, transparency, there's no rule of law basically in China. So what do I say about that? I say it's not sustainable. What we show in the book is there's many examples in world history of kind of unsustainable periods of economic growth. Like a famous example would be Argentina. For 50 years, up until the 1920s, Argentina grew very rapidly. It was one of the richest countries in the world, probably one of the 10 richest countries in the world in 1920. But it never had inclusive political institutions. It was this combination of extractive political institutions with inclusive economic institutions. It generated growth, but it can only do that in a transitory way. Another fantastic example would be the Soviet Union. Between the mid-1920s, for 50 years, the Soviet Union was one of the most rapidly growing economies in the world. When I was an undergraduate, we learned all this stuff about how great central planning was. And young people laugh when you tell them that nowadays, but it's true. I even went and checked, we have this story in Why Nations Fail. I went and got my old textbook on comparative economic systems that I read at the library at the LSE, and it's there. It says, like, if you want to have a successful economic development, you need to have central planning and a Soviet style economy. It's kind of laughable in retrospect, but I think that shows you how easily you can be fooled, by 20 or 30 years economic growth. I mean, it was in every single textbook. If you go back and read Paul Samuelson's, one of the greatest economists of all time, Paul Samuelson's textbook, again, which I read as an undergraduate, he had this graph of like the Soviet Union overtaking the US, and then if you look at the 1960s version of his book, it's overtaking in the 1970s, and then they kind of delay it, and it's overtaking in the 1980s, and then delay it, it's overtaking in the 1990s, and then the graph disappears. And then it comes back, except instead of the Soviet Union overtaking the United States, it's China, So I think
same author, same idea, different country.
Yeah, I think like this is why, this is a good reason for studying history. It's a good reason for studying history. So I think, even though when I stand up and talk about this, people say, oh no, come on, can't be, and China has managed to do lots of things that the Soviet Union never did. China's economy is based on exporting. So that forces you to be much more efficient, to produce, competitively what people want, so that there's all sorts of benefits from the Chinese model compared to the Soviet model, but I think that's my view, is that you can't have an inclusive economy at the whim of a dictatorship. Look at Jack Ma, look at anyone who starts complaining, they disappear for 3 months and nobody knows where they are. The tennis player, lady tennis player, you can't have an innovative society in such a totalitarian state. It's like Russia, like the head of Lukoil criticizes Putin and he falls out the window of the hospital. This is just totalitarian You can't have a innovative
One of my
society
favorite
like that in a sustained way,
One of my favorite economists, I was listening to them once, and they were speaking to a Chinese economist, and they said, well, what I love about the Chinese economy is how fast we're growing and how much productivity is happening here, and how we're going to overcome the rest of the world because of it. He goes, oh, okay. He says, well, what's your favorite part about the United States? He goes, oh, when it's going bad in the United States, you're allowed to say so, right? And it's there's a new good book called The Quiet Americans about the intelligence agency during the 1940s to 1950s working on Moscow. What's amazing when you're reading the book is to recognize how little information we really had from the inside, how we really didn't understand, how when you have a controlled economy, the one thing that you do have the power to do is to make certain that the information that's being dispersed in and out of your country is dramatically controlled. That's something we don't have the ability to do in the U.S. It's dramatically distributed here, which, of course, empowers individuals as part of the process.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good thing. I mean, I think, one fact I find very telling is all of these Chinese entrepreneurs and business people, they just want to get out of the country. They want to get their family out of the country. They want to buy property out of the country. They all want, foreign passports, Canadian passports, Australian passports, whatever it is. Like, I think that tells you a lot about people's expectations about what's going to happen in the future. In China, yeah, of course you can grow fast. You have very low wages. You're just basically benefiting from all these innovations and ideas and technologies that were invented somewhere else, and you're just adopting them. But that, yeah.
Yeah, Larry Summers was on, and he said, look, if I were to summarize what I've seen, he said the issue is there are two factors to watch constantly: where does capital want to go, and where does labor want to go? And he said they want to come into the United States, and they're trying to get out of China. All right, so on the narrow corridor, I really think with all of this authoritarian populism that's happening today, especially as that can begin to become a threat not only to Western democracy, but to liberty and to the individual itself, the narrow corridor really laid out a beautiful concept that perpetuated what you had done in the work with Why Nations Fail. But would you describe that narrow corridor, the box, how you have very strong states and how you can have very strong societies and how they conflict with one another, and what that corridor actually means?
Yeah, I think in the narrow, I think in Why Nations Fail, we did a good job of sort of trying to give people a simple way of thinking about these differences. But I mentioned, that this is also it's a sort of historical process, how Nigeria becomes Nigeria and the United States becomes the United States, and we do talk about that. But we felt we hadn't done a good job of helping people understand that process. The emergence of inclusive societies and how things can go wrong and how you can become sort of extractive. So I think the narrow corridor is much more focused on the process and how difficult it is to get the process going, and also how you can fall out of this corridor. So the idea, so it's as you said, it's the idea is there's a balance between, there's a contest in some sense between the state and the society. People are trying to control the government and they're trying to get it to do what they want, but the government is trying to control people also. That's what happens in China, and that's what happened, that it happens here too. So many people are concerned about that. So there's this contest, and what you see in many parts of the world, and this is a way we use of sort of classifying societies, is some parts of the world, like China, what you have is, the state dominates society, but society can also dominate the state. That's true in large parts of Africa, for example, or South Asia. The society is very powerful relative to the state, or you could say historically in much of the world also, before modern state institutions were developed. So the difficult thing in developing inclusive institutions is you have to get this balance between state and society right. And once you get it right, then there's all sorts of mechanisms that can kind of lead that competition. That competition is very creative. In the process, as we say, states become stronger, society becomes stronger, more cohesive, kind of more coherent identities, better able to act collectively, the state becomes stronger. So that competition is it's very creative and it's very powerful, but it can also become sort of unstable, So we try to tell, I'm not sure, I understand very well all of this autocratic populism we have in the world today. It's very, Hungary, the Philippines, Brazil. It's a very complicated, Russia. It's a very complicated phenomena, and it's happening in different contexts. That it's a sort of global thing. So you look for global processes, globalization or rising inequality, or I don't know, but it's a very complicated thing. But we try to think about how that could happen. How could we talk about it? We have one chapter which we call Red Queen Out of Control. We describe this kind of competition between state and society as the Red Queen effect, and then we think about how you can move out of the corridor. Like the example we use, the sort of leading example we use would be Nazi Germany. In some sense, Germany kind of historically was a society like Britain or Western Europe that sort of had this dynamic, developing more inclusive institutions, stronger society, stronger state. But then it crashed out of the corridor in the 1930s with the Nazi kind of state, and in many ways that was popular. There were millions of Germans voted for Hitler. He didn't have a majority, of course, and he had to fix everything to take power. But a kind of in retrospect, unbelievable number of Germans supported Hitler and the Nazis, the construction of the Nazi state. So we were trying to sort of think through what mechanisms could lead to such an outcome. I don't know if that's, we try to talk about that in the context today. That's just really sort of putting ideas out there. I'm not sure social scientists really understand this very well. I don't know what your view about this is, but it's a very complicated phenomenon.
Definitely. I tend to buy into what Eric Hoffer told us maybe 60 years ago, 70 years ago. He said that all revolutions that happen, none happen from people who have a lot and want more. None happen from people who have nothing and want something. They all happen from a group of people who had something and lose a piece of it. I think in the United States, you can see, as an example, polling of optimism. Minority groups are much more optimistic than middle-class white America, especially the lower two quartiles of white America. And the reason for that tends to be that even though the lower two quartiles are actually still doing better than their minority counterparts in the United States, the minority groups are seeing growth, and the Anglo community is feeling like they've lost something. Now, it doesn't take, by the way, I think those losses aren't just economic. I think some of them, through political correctness, are social losses that they're feeling, pressure, constraint, the creating invisibility. And it's inevitable when you turn someone invisible that someone will come along and see them, and when he recognizes them and speaks their language, that they'll follow him regardless of whether he lies or cheats or steals or does anything else, because now they feel seen. Well, to me, the challenge, it begins with understanding how well we have it, all right, putting things in perspective. And unfortunately, I think people are being bombarded by negative messages from the nightly news, from political parties, from political candidates. They're getting so much negativity that they lose the ability to really see perspective. You've been all over the world. I mean, I love the fact that you go into, I know that you won't work as a consultant because you said that was not a positive experience for you, but that you go around and you help advise and give people information about what works. I also love your historical perspective. One of the things I can't remember if it was the last book or the first book, but you talked about in the 250 years, the changes that have happened between economies and how the rule of law, when it came about, actually had an effect on that. I'd love to hear you opine on that.
Yeah. I mean, gosh, on what?
Well, on the idea that countries used to be much closer together economically, and that separation has grown, and that part of that you can watch the beginnings of that, or the genesis of that, with the rule of law and the pushback on the king. At least that was my read of what I read that you had written.
No, I think that's right. I mean, if you're going to talk about the emergence of, we talked a little bit about the dynamics of extractive and inclusive institutions and how, Venice could become inclusive and then go extractive. But of course, the big picture in the world in the last 250 years is the other direction. Societies like, my own country, England, that were pretty extractive, and we give lots of examples, became much more inclusive, and that's our explanation for why the Industrial Revolution happens when it does and where it does. That especially in the 17th century, there was a lot of contestation over the organization of society politically and economically, and out of that, much more inclusive political institutions emerged, much more accountability, much more representation, a much more powerful central state with a modern fiscal system and bureaucracy. And that led to enormous inclusion in the economic sphere. So it opened up the economic sphere. So it's a sort of transition from extractive to inclusive. So you could say there that, the message is very optimistic in the sense that, 250 years ago, the differences in the, income levels of income per capita between England and Nigeria, might have been 4 or 5, not 50 or 70. So that enormous gap is something that's actually only appeared in the past 250 years. And it's appeared because some societies, Western Europe, North America, made this transition towards much more inclusive economic institutions from extractive institutions. And, of course, how that happened in Britain is different from the US, but in the US, we sort of tell the story comparing the US to Latin America. And why is it that these colonies in apparently very similar circumstances with very similar ideas and technologies, the US becomes far more inclusive and compared to Latin America, and how that explains the differences in prosperity and inequality between North America and South America. So that's the thing about the language of inclusive and extractive institutions is very useful for talking about these differences. But of course, if I look at, how a society goes from becoming extractive to inclusive, there's lots of different ways that could happen. The way that happened in the United States, in 17th century Virginia is different from the way that happened in, 17th century England, for example. There's different factors and different mechanisms at play, but yeah, these differences. So that's a very optimistic message, like all of this, incredible technology and prosperity in the world. That's something that we've all created, humans have created in the last 250 years by making society more inclusive. It's just that hasn't spread everywhere in the world, and that's the problem of development. Yeah.
Now, your argument that I really enjoyed on that is that so many economists today believe, that's all because of geography, or it's because of natural resources. You gave a couple of comparisons that I thought were beautiful. One was Nogales, which is, I'm in Arizona, so that's one that hits close to home. And the other one was the Koreas. Maybe if you talk a little bit about those two.
Yeah, we use what an economist would call natural experiments to try to sort of illustrate our theme of institutions and sort of say, there's, of course, you could think of other explanations, like Africa is poor because it's in the tropics, or there's malaria, whatever it is, but, or Africans have some culture which is kind of incompatible with capitalism or whatever. But what we try to show using these natural experiments is that, oh, come on, it's got to be institutions. If you think about this Korean Peninsula, it's a sort of fantastic thing. If you look at the Korean Peninsula at night, you see that North Korea is completely dark, and South Korea is just a blaze of light, okay? And that's indicative of enormous differences in prosperity and living standards and opportunities. And why, how could that be? It's all Korea. It's the Korean Peninsula. The geography is very similar. They're all Koreans. It's culturally similar, deep kind of historic, all the same. It's obvious what generates that difference. Everybody knows the answer. That's why that example is so nice. It's the way the Koreans organize the economy. In the North, you have this socialist model that killed incentives, killed opportunities, killed markets. In the South, you had something completely different. And why do you have that? Why is it that North Korea is like that? Is that because they have bad economists in North Korea? No, they have a dictatorship. That's why it's like that. Okay. So I think that basically that illustrates the entire theme of the book. We could have just written a chapter on Korea and left it at that, but the publisher said, no, you've got to kind of elaborate a little bit.
Your publisher was right. I enjoyed the rest of it.
Yeah, and we also use this example of Nogales. Nogales, United States, Nogales, Mexico. Kind of, there's a fence down the middle. It's culturally very similar, historically very similar, but there's enormous differences in living standards, in security, in people's opportunities. Why is it that people want to go from the south to the north and not the other way around? That's everything to do with the institutions also in that case. So we use a series of those examples to kind of just sort of get across in a simple way, oh yeah, they've got to be right. Before we get into the details, we got to sell you on the big story with those examples.
All right, so I'm going to change course just a little bit. Colonialism, how does that fit into this story? Was it helpful, harmful? What's your view of that?
Well, I think there's a lot of variation in colonialism. The United States was a colony. Australia and New Zealand were colonies. So I think historians make this big distinction between settler colonies and non-settler colonies. I think what you see is that European colonies which could occupy spaces where there were very few indigenous people, and in particular where you couldn't create a viable society by exploiting indigenous people, they developed, very different type of institutions, much more participatory, much more inclusive than places like, Mexico or Peru, where, or large parts of Africa, where you could basically build a colonial society by exploiting indigenous people. So I think, colonialism, if you look at former colonies, you have the entire world distribution of income within former colonies. So it's not colonial. I mean, of course, it's not colonialism per se, but colonialism did very different things in different contexts. Of course, in the United States, colonialism expropriated indigenous people and stole their land. And, so I'm not advocating colonialism at all. I don't think colonialism was a good thing anywhere, actually. But I'm just saying in terms of prosperity, it has very different consequences depending on the context. So we use that as a way of saying, no, this is not about culture. It's not about, Anglo-Saxons, in North America or Spaniards, or Latins in South America. We don't think that's the issue at all. It's really, and that's what the scientific evidence shows. This is really to do with the conditions in the colonies and the kind of types of societies that emerged. We use the early history of Virginia and we contrast that with the early history of Buenos Aires and Argentina to kind of illustrate how these different types of societies emerged, with much more inclusive in North America, much more extractive in Latin America, with these long historical consequences that we've been discussing today.
Yeah, it's it's fascinating, but I think it still fits into the narrative of the book, which is when 20% of the people are extracting the goods from 80% of the people, it's going to be a problem, whether it's government that's doing it or whether it's being done because there's no government whatsoever and someone's taking advantage of them. So when you look back on that history and you go and you talk to people who are in Latin American countries, what's the message that you give to them? I know that has to be sometimes difficult just because they'll see it as being somewhat ethnocentric, but what's the message that you give to them in terms of what they need to do to help improve their economies?
Well, I think, I don't have one of the benefits of this, the terminology inclusive and extractive is useful because it's very flexible, we have one chapter where we say, why nations fail to get today. And we look at North Korea, Zimbabwe, Argentina, Uzbekistan, places which are extremely different, culturally, historically, institutionally. And what do these places have in common? They're all poor and they all have extractive institutions. But, when it comes to actually improving or changing something, then all the details become very important. All the details of, all the details of the differences between the institutions in Uzbekistan and Zimbabwe become very important. So that's, I think if you want to actually engage in such a way as to make constructive suggestions about how to make society more inclusive, then you need to have that kind of institutional knowledge, and you need to have a mastery of the institutional differences and the political context. I mean, I think that, the simple thing I tell people is, you need to make your society more inclusive. I think you go to any Latin American country, it's very easy to identify extractive institutions everywhere and point them out to people. But actually changing that, that's a very different thing. That's a political issue. You have to understand the politics, and you have to understand, how to build a coalition for a more inclusive society. So then, you can look at history and try to understand, how extractive societies like England, how did they build more inclusive institutions? And there's even examples or at least some examples in the region. Chile is a relatively successful example. You could say Barbados is a very interesting example of building much more inclusive societies. So, but I think, unfortunately, there's a long shadow of history in Latin America. You don't see, now the Chileans at the moment, they just rejected this new constitution. They're kind of agonizing about how to organize their society and try to reconcile these different interests. And so maybe
you can see where Pinochet, where Pinochet's strength may have helped in that to help bring apart inclusive policies. Fascinating enough, because he was considered to be, and probably was, somebody who was very much an authoritarian. I find that to be a fascinating dichotomy.
Yeah, but my view about Chile is, I think if you go back to the 19th century, Chile looks completely different to everywhere else in Latin America. If you go back to the colonial period, when I teach about this, I always say, Chile looks much more like the United States than anywhere else in Latin America. There were indigenous people, but they were way off in the south, beyond the frontier. In fact, like in the US, they were beyond the frontier. So Chile never developed these kind of extractive institutions, that we've been talking about in colonial Latin America. You see much more political participation in the colonial period. The 19th century, they have the best state, they build the most railway, have the most effective military, they steal the Bolivian's coast. There's a controversial issue for you in Bolivia, at least. I think it's actually it's much deeper than that. Like, I don't give President Pinochet much credit, actually. I think it's a much more historical thing. Chile always looks different going all the way back. And I think, now I think there's a big problem with this constitution written by the military, but of course they can't decide what to do, but that's okay. It takes time. You're not going to get that right straight away, I think. And I think, I've been.
Do you think that constitution's beneficial for them long term? Is it more inclusive?
I think it's just not legitimate. That's the problem. Okay. Whether particular parts of it are kind of good for the economy or not, I think that's not the issue here. I think it's much more kind of visceral and symbolic about the kind of getting over the society, the kind of getting. That was a very traumatic period. I mean, my wife has done a lot of research in Chile, and she did a dissertation in Chile. So I spent quite a lot of time there, and it's a very, very traumatic period, and they're still recovering from that, the Chileans. And after the transition, there was a lot of let's not talk about it, because if we talk about it, something terrible is going to happen. So they kind of repressed it for a long time, and now it's all sort of coming out, and I think that's probably pretty healthy. I mean, British people would never do that, it's not a British thing, repress everything in Britain, but the Latins, I think it's pretty healthy, and I think something good can come out of it. And so I'm not, and we could argue about different bits and pieces of it, about whether we thought this was a good idea or not. But I think that's not the big question. I'm pretty happy that I'm pretty convinced that the Chileans will come up with something which will make stuff work. I think Chile works very well generally.
It does seem like there's an arc. I mean, I didn't see this in your book, but I would think that the arc of the United States, going through the suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, the equal rights movements, the human rights movement, all of those tended to be looking for a greater inclusiveness. It was more people demanding a seat at the table. And of course, that starts to spill over into economic issues as well, I would guess. Maybe your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, so the two chapters where we talk about these dynamics, where we talk about the dynamics of inclusive institutions, we talk about the virtuous circle, but I think actually we do a better job in Narrow Corridor of talking about this, this Red Queen effect, which is about why would this dynamic have the property that you just identified, which is it's sort of driving you in a more inclusive direction. What would it be? And I think that's what we were trying to capture, albeit imperfectly. There's something about the process that pushes you in a more inclusive direction. Yeah, I think that's a very nice observation you made there, and that's something we've been trying to capture. But it's not obvious. It can go in, it can go into reverse, and but I think there's some hope to believe that that's the path Chile is on. And I think.
All right.
Yeah.
So here's a question. I have to ask this. So this book became an international sensation. Everybody around the world was reading it. It was literally a common touch point in people that I was talking to overseas. Did you guys know that up front that it was going to be that big, that it was going to take off the way that it did?
No, not at all. In fact, we wrote a previous book we wrote a lot of scientific papers together. We wrote a previous book, which is full of hundreds of pages of mathematics, and which sold 10,000 copies, amazing, which is like amazing. So I remember when we wrote Why Nations Fail, we thought like, well, if this sells 20,000 copies, we'll be like really, really So I think, I think we have a lot of, I'm very good friends with Jared Diamond. I co-edited a book with Jared. I organized many conferences with him. He's just such an incredible person and intellectual. And I've seen so many people who've just read his stuff and just makes them think about the world. It gets them excited. And I always think, gosh, okay, I have PhD students and I teach, and I like that, but if you can reach people the way he reached people, wouldn't that be amazing? So we thought we'd have a go at it, but we expected to fail miserably, I have to tell you.
Wow, that's amazing. And
Yeah.
you just did what your passion told you to do, which was to write something that you believed in, and it turned into being a great success.
Yeah, well,
That's
I think you have to take risks in life, don't you? I mean, in academia, you have to take risks. Like I don't know how many ideas we've had where we've told them to people, and they, like other academics, and they just like start laughing hysterically. Our most cited paper that we wrote, Professor Asamoglu and I, our most cited paper, it's like one of the most cited papers in economics. We explained the idea once at the weekend at MIT when we were working on it to a very distinguished MIT economist who burst into laughing. He thought it was the most ridiculous thing he'd heard in his life. So I think like we could have just said, oh, okay, forget that. But you have to believe in yourself. My mother used to say, if you don't believe in yourself, who's going to believe in you? You just got to believe in yourself and just like suck it up and go for it.
You have to be fearless sometimes. So is there a new book coming out that we should be looking forward to?
We're not coming out. We're talking about it. About it. I gave a talk at Harvard in the spring, which we're talking about it. We have a lot of work to do, though. Yeah, we have a lot of work to do.
What would the concept be on, if you could share that with us?
I could share it with you. I think that the previous book, the first book we wrote, and a lot of research we've done is about democracy and the origins of democracy, and when and how does democracy emerge, and when is it stable? And then we've been talking about inclusion, and so at some fundamental level, like how do humans think about that? How do humans think about equality, and where does that come from? Like, do we care about equality intrinsically, and if so, why, and where does that come from? Because we also like hierarchy. I'm English, we love the Queen, and we love status, and economists all work for the Nobel Prize. What's that about? It's not about the money, it's just pure status. So humans are sort of have these contradictory impulses. On the one hand, we sort of seem to care about equality, and not just because of the economic benefits or whatever. We get annoyed at inequity or injustice, but we also tolerate and rationalize hierarchy. So how do you think about that? So we've been reading a lot of kind of much more historical work about, the emergence of human society and transition from primates to early human society. What do we know about that? And just kind of thinking about historical examples. But, we're very far from writing anything vaguely sensible.
That sounds exciting. Fukuyama wrote just a small section in his book Identity about the whole concept of how this individualism, Martin Luther took that to a new level by putting it into spiritual terms, and then Jean Rousseau took that and made it a secular process. But he really, I bet he didn't spend 6 paragraphs talking about an idea that I was hoping there'd be a whole book about. When you do that, I'd love to read it.
Okay.
Well,
Good.
James, thank you so much. I can't tell you how much we appreciate you being on our show. I also can't tell you how much I appreciate you being in the world. You doing these 2 pieces of work. I think they really have been, they've been global altering, and they've certainly helped me in my thinking. I just want to thank you for being on our show here at the Optimistic American.
My pleasure. It's been a lot of fun.
All right. Thank you very much.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.